Now there's another question that cropped up that I know that Tad and I believe Mark Chirnside, if he's still with us, I know that the two of you wanted to talk about this question. It's a really good one. What's the difference between a Titanic enthusiast and a Titanic historian? So you guys want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take the first part. What's the difference between an enthusiast and a historian? And then I know Mark was going to delve into a little bit more of the difference between a researcher and historian. But what I view somebody, and I'll preface this in advance that there's no right or wrong here. Not everybody who's interested in a historic topic has to be a researcher, has to do original research on their own. It's quite all right and perfectly fine to be interested in something and just be enthusiastic about learning about it and enjoying reading books, watching movies, that sort of thing. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But I view an enthusiast as somebody, maybe someone who's a fan of the Cameron movie or one of the other films or documentaries and likes reading books about the subject and just finds it overall interesting. But they don't necessarily conduct original research or delve in beyond the surface. And maybe they're a collector that likes to own postcards and objects, but they don't really research the history of the ship. And that's okay. That's a different category. And that's something where I think there's probably more people that are enthusiasts than researchers. And that's really just a different category. And a lot of researchers and historians have started out by being an enthusiast about Titanic or whatever your niche area of history that you want to learn about is. And then sometimes you find there's questions that aren't answered by existing books and documentaries, and you start delving into it and finding out things for yourself and asking those unanswered questions and trying to figure it out. So as far as enthusiast versus researcher, there's not a right or wrong. It's what your personal level of interest is. But I know Mark has an interesting thought on the research aspect and responsibility that people have related to that.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, it's interesting because if you have a title Titanic historian, I mean, there's no job spec, and it's not the kind of thing that someone does to earn a living. It's not a 9 to 5 or full-time job. It's something that people do, people do as an amateur, really. And I mean that in the old sense, you amateur as in you're doing something as a labor of love, whereas not in the modern sense that, you're amateurish, you're not really doing it properly. And I think the whole point about, finding new sources or information that's not been available before is key in terms of being a researcher. But I think the huge problem with Titanic research is that there's been so much information, so many books, so many articles, so many programs on the subject. Someone could write, I'm not advocating this, but someone could write a book and not actually do any research. And it's been known to happen. They could simply take, citations from all the different secondary sources that are already out there, put it together. That's really not adding anything new to the subject. And I suppose in terms of researcher versus historian, I suppose I would say a historian has to be a researcher, but there's also the analytical side to it. And I guess there's a bit more emphasis in terms of analysis of that research, analysis of those sources. And, this is so critical just to understand. I mean, there are basic facts about Titanic that are simply not understood. And maybe if I give an example of that, there's this long-standing myth, this long-standing belief that J.P. Morgan, either as the individual or in terms of the bank with the name, financed construction of Olympic Titanic, and Britannic, of course, to follow. That's a widespread belief. It's repeated in I don't know how many books, documentaries, probably the Wikipedia page if we checked it. And yet the reality is it's simply not true. But I can see why people might have thought that. There was a guy who worked for the White Star Line. I think the name was Frank Bustard. And some of his recollections he shared with the Titanic Historical Society. I think this must have been the late 1970s, something around that, 60s or 70s, that kind of time frame where his recollections were published. And one of the things he said, I believe, was something to the effect that without Morgan, without IMM, these ships wouldn't have come into being. So the kind of implication is that that's where the financial resource came from to build these ships. In reality, the source of finance is very clear. If you read the annual report for IMM for 1908, J. Bruce Ismay, of course, was president, and there was the IMM board of directors. They described in the annual report that the funds for this shipbuilding project were being raised by White Star, were being borrowed by White Star. We've got a copy of the prospectus that was issued in 1908 to prospective investors. They borrowed the money, so they issued bonds to people, and of course they had to pay interest on it. These bonds show up on the White Star Line balance sheet. So in terms of finance and how the money was raised, it's actually very well documented. But it's the opposite to what we see in so many secondary sources. And actually, the question came up fairly recently on one of the Facebook discussion groups. Someone was asking about it, so I went through the detail, explained it. I found out later they'd gone to another group and basically commented, "Oh, some guy's saying that JP Morgan didn't finance construction of Olympic and Titanic," and I think there were about 4 or 5 people that jumped in and said, "Oh, I've looked at all my books, and you're right, JP Morgan did finance construction of Olympic and Titanic." So they've been provided with all the information, that they could look up, they could verify. And you've simply got this, I guess this failure. People are sort of going with what they're familiar with or what's been repeated from book to book or television program to another. So I think a huge part of it is that analytical side as well. You've got to research the subject. You've got to get as much as possible in terms of resources, but also just dig deeply in terms of doing that analysis. But simply getting all that information together, it actually involves doing quite a bit of research. And it's by combining that, finding those sources and taking the analytical side, the historian really should operate. I think so often there are claims about Titanic that are simply wrong. And I'm talking fact here. I'm not talking differences of opinion where we might have different views on something. And yet the evidence we have is completely at odds with popular belief or what's been written in so many books. And it's by doing that analysis that you get to the bottom of it. So I guess that would be my view. I've probably been rabbiting on for quite a bit.
No, Mark. I mean, what you're saying is right on point. I would go a little bit further. I see a lot of people who have emotional attachments to things that they may have read or seen in a documentary or a program or from 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Big thing for me that I see a lot is the Titanic central propeller, where there's this emotional attachment. It had to have 4 blades because that's, it was in all the movies. All the models have 4 blades on the center propeller. And yet that's a conclusion that's based on an assumption. The assumption is that Titanic's propeller was identical to Olympic's, but the more research we do on propellers on multiple ships of that era is that they changed them as often as, or sometimes more often than we change a tire on a car. They were expendable components and they were constantly tinkering with them, trying to find the best balance of blade size, propeller size, rotations on the turbine or the reciprocating. It was constant, the pitch of the blades, everything. So when you're a historian, you have to be willing to let go of everything you've seen in the movie, everything you've seen in multiple movies or shows, or read in so many books that are basically just copying off of each other. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Bill could probably go on a long discussion about this, but Bill, do you want to mention how many times books and articles have repeated the wrong number of survivors and victims?
A lot of books will say over 1,500 died. No, there's exactly 1,496 people perished on the Titanic. We have the names. And if you want to say over 1,500 people, well, who do you want to pick off those lists that died? It's wrong. We like I said, we've got the names. There's 3 separate researchers that I know of that came to the same numbers: Phil Gowan, Herman Soldner, and Lester Mitchum. They all worked separately. They all came to the same points. If you look at their survivor lists or passenger lists, you'll see some very minor differences in the way names are spelled, but that's it. The other thing I wanted to mention, and just because somebody writes a book does not make them a researcher or a historian. There's 2 books that I know of that came out around the time of the 1997 movie. I bought both of them. They were complete crap. One of them, I actually started doing some research and I could find where they had come up with what they said somewhere on the internet. One of the books said that the Olympic was on site at the wreck site the morning of April 15th. Not true, but this book said it was. They had a crew list that I looked at and I went, this looks like the crew list I supplied to Encyclopedia Titanica in 1999 or 2000. And my list had a few people on it that I had found references to, and my notes said, no, they really weren't on the Titanic. But this particular book had grabbed my list off from Encyclopedia Titanica, copied it without the notes. So I know where that one came from. But just because you write a book does not mean it's worthwhile.
I think that's one of the
Some
big
of them are just
things.
junk.
Yeah, one of the big things is editors at publishing companies really don't know the history behind Titanic. They may have seen the movie, they may know a little bit about the ship, but they don't know the history. So they read a well-written manuscript and they go, hey, we could sell this. And they're willing to put their name behind it, print it, and everyone makes some money off of it. Doesn't mean it's a good book. Same with documentary producers. They don't know the history of the ships. They're depending on people that they go to who are recommended to them. And at that point, how good are the recommendations? Are they really being linked in with people who are historians? Or are they being linked in with people who pitch a fancy idea that the producers like because they know it will keep people past the next commercial break? So just because your name is on the cover of a book doesn't mean you're a good Titanic researcher or historian. Just because you appear in a Titanic documentary doesn't mean your facts are straight. I believe it was last week, there was a documentary that aired, very sad subject about the Titan tragedy, but I lost count of the historical errors that were perpetuated in that show regarding Titanic, that she was out to make the speed record, take the blue ribbon, that 1,507 people died on the ship. Well, we know that's not an accurate number, and a number of other mistakes that were made as well. So don't believe it unless you read it in a reliable book that's done, primary sources are referenced, critical thinking is done, and know your historians. We revise our work. We try to make ourselves available to the public so that you can see that we're really trying to get things right. And we're working hard to revise our own work to make sure it's in harmony with the latest thing. We're not stuck 20, 30 years in the past. Hopefully that helps to answer that question.
Kent, it brings to mind an anecdote, and I won't mention any names. It concerns a documentary. I mean, this was probably 10, 15 years ago. And the producers were adamant that they needed someone that knew everything about the Titanic. They approached someone who I know pretty well, and who I think is probably one of the very top leading people in the world in terms of their Titanic knowledge. And this person said, well, I do know a lot about Titanic, but I don't know absolutely everything. These are my areas of strengths, and these are the areas I'm not as good at. So they just outlined, what they could offer for the program, for the documentary. And they weren't taken up on the offer. And the response was, oh, it's okay. We found someone who did know everything, because they'd gone to some guy who said, yes, I know everything about Titanic. And judging from their contributions, I don't think they did know everything about Titanic. It was probably their lack of knowledge that led them to think they knew everything. My personal experience is, the more I research this subject, the more you realize actually there is so much more to learn. So if someone's saying, oh, I know absolutely everything about Titanic, or I'm an expert, then that's a huge red flag for me. But yeah, this person, they're approached by this production company. Yeah, we need an expert. We need someone who knows everything. That's what happened.
And that's what producers want. They want, the one talking head that can fill the program and keeps everybody hooked. Unfortunately,
I guarantee you that Tad, Kent, and I don't know everything.
That's
Collectively, we know a lot. Everything, no.
And I will say, this is not to belabor the point, and I won't mention names, but Mark alluded to some well-known individuals that are very credible for a number of reasons, that have made some claims about the design of the ship and some other things that people on the internet echo chamber, they see the name and their background and assume that they're accurate, which I understand. But if you can't really assume that, because sometimes the claims that are made, even by people who have done other good work and do have some background history that's credible, it isn't something we can always assume is accurate just because of the name attached to it, even if it's recognizable.
It's very true. Just because they're an expert in one area or have worked on one project or another that maybe we like, maybe, oh yeah, that was a good program, that was very entertaining, doesn't mean that their latest work is going to have all of the research behind it. There's a reason that Mark in his presentation chose to talk about the strength of Olympic and Titanic's original design. It's because within the last year or so, there have been some claims from some pretty well-known individuals that Olympic and Titanic as designed were weak ships and basically just accidents waiting to happen. It's perpetuating myths that go back 20 odd years. But when you look at the facts, they may be difficult to sort out. It may be dry to look at archival paperwork, but that's what you've got to do to find the actual truth of what was going on back then, and the way these ships were designed and how they compared to other ships that were built at the time. So hopefully all that answers that question for our listener.